Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to Creating Values Driven Business Value. I'm Abby Lundberg, Editor in Chief at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be moderating this event. Leaders often struggle to show the business value of leading with strong values around such issues as sustainability and human rights. But our speaker today has literally written the book on how to do that. In this webinar, you'll learn how to identify and act on values-driven opportunities that also improve operations, benefit customers and employees, and bolster the bottom line. Daniel Aronson is the founder of Valutus, and I probably am saying that wrong. Daniel, you can correct me when you come on, a consulting firm specializing in creating value through sustainability and responsibility. He's also the author of the new book, The Value of Values: How Leaders Can Grow Their Businesses and Enhance Their Careers by Doing the Right Thing. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Abby. And no, you got it exactly right. The word valutus is actually, I'm not a Latin scholar, so perhaps it's pronounced differently by Latin scholars, but it's the Latin root for the word value and the word values, which have the same root.
Cool. All right, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Today, we're going to talk about the business value of values. This is really important because there's so much more than people believe. We're going to cover four main topics today. First, how values help you win in the competitive environment. Second, how they lead. And third, how when you're making a difference, you have to overcome, fourth, some of the challenges involved in acting on values. Before we dive into each of those, though, we're going to start with a question and a framework that's going to be incredibly important, which is, how do we see the true value of values? As it happens, most of the value of values and acting on them is submerged, hidden beneath the surface. In fact, typically, submerged value is 4 times as much as visible value or more, which means that we often misunderstand how much value there is. And as Ben Franklin said over 200 years ago, when that happens, that causes real problems. One example of this is the concept of sustainability. Sustainability is often thought of as something that is about fables and not finance. But if we look just a little bit deeper, just a little bit beneath the surface, what we discover is even in these stories that we teach our children, there's clear examples of the submerged value of values. Take, for example, the story of the boy who cried wolf. What is the cost of the boy's dishonesty in the story? The loss of his family's entire flock. Now that's more than the value that would have been generated by all kinds of things that we would normally think of as clearly business related, such as using AI to optimize grazing patterns, or feeding the sheep a high growth diet, or even hiring a great wool marketing consultant. All of those things, even put together, are less than the value created by acting on values. And yet, the value of values all too often goes uncounted. That's what we're going to fix today. And that brings us to our first takeaway, which is submerged value is key. Submerged value is key to understanding the true value of values. How do you see it? Well, the first thing that we do is to look at your business. What resources, relationships, and routines does it rely on? And what happens if you have less or more of some of those? For example, what happens if you have less access to the water you need for production, or more of the strong, valuable relationships that you need with distributors and with suppliers? Could acting on values or not doing so cause either of those things to happen? That's the beginning of looking for that submerged value. Now we're going to shift into the question of, how do values help you win in the competitive marketplace? And here we're going to use a framework we call CORE, which breaks down the way that values create business value into 4 components: customers, operations, risks, and employees. We'll start with customers. It's been known for decades that people don't just buy the function of a product, they buy the way the product makes them feel. And this is true even in many, many big industries that have long relationships and giant companies. Having values changes how the customers feel and creates a competitive advantage. As an example, consider Tony's Chocolonely, whose reason for being is to create change for the better in the cocoa supply chain. Last year, their revenue grew 23%, reaching over $150 million, even though the chocolate industry is full of giant competitors that have been around in some cases for over 100 years. And it's not just the case of things like chocolate and direct supply chains. Another company that makes cleaning supplies discovered that when their customers and prospects learned of their climate action, they actually reported that that company's products smelled better. Because hearing about the values and seeing that values connect changed their experience of the product. And this changes sales. New York University looked at tens of thousands of products over multiple years and discovered that only about 1/6 of them were marketed as having sustainable attributes, but those products created 1/3 of all growth in the market. McKinsey and Nielsen IQ found the same thing, that sustainably marketed products produce more growth. Now, what that does is cause changes not only in your behavior, but in the behavior of other companies and your industry. For example, imagine that you're here and these are the other companies in your industry. Maybe you're even in the top, say, third on values-based issues. You think, you know what? We're going to move. And that's a good thing, because guess what? Everybody else is thinking the same thing. If this matters to customers, let's do more. In fact, one company that we worked with, they set a goal for their climate ambitions that was in the top quartile of their industry. And 1 year later, it was in the bottom quartile. That's because everybody is moving to be more values driven. And if you don't, you get left behind. Now, that brings up what happens after this, which is that differentiation is affected by values. And we hear all the time that, in fact, it's becoming harder to differentiate and that there's more commodification. And when that's true, values become more important, because when choices seem the same, standing out matters even more. Now, you may hear someone say, you know what, that's all fine, but values are just the icing on the cake. And it's true, but not in the way that skeptics typically mean that statement. It is true that things like price and quality, even style, typically matter more than values, but those things are also more commodified. After all, what do you actually see when you go into a bakery? All the cakes are iced. Even in the literal case of icing on the cake, people know that that matters. Now, my company, Valuetis, has done a lot of research on this all around the world. And we've looked at how much it causally matters when you change the attributes of one product versus its competitive set. If you are behind, that's one thing. But what if you're a leader? Well, if you're a leader, then when customers discover that, preference goes up for you. And this is true not just for North America, but it's true around the world. And especially look at the gain in places like Europe. Now, I said that's for leadership, but what if you're behind? What if you're a laggard? Well, here you see again the effect that values have. Maybe you have a very strong initial preference, but the baseline really goes down in North America when you have values laggardship, and look at the decline in Europe when that happens. Just tremendous declines. In order to take advantage of this, one of the things that's important to think about is it's not static either. And you can quantify this effect. Here's a tool that actually quantifies the financial value of leading, and the tool also does lagging on values. It starts with some basics, such as how big is the company, market share, and so forth. Imagine a $10 billion market, 10% market share, $1 billion revenue company. And then looks at how much does environmental and social action matter to customers. In this case, we're going to say 4%. Everything else is 96%. That means these are much less important, and everything else is 24 times more important for customers' decision making. But that doesn't mean they don't matter. It doesn't mean that even if some customers will never buy from you because they're only going to buy from a competitor, it's still worth tens of millions of dollars. And that's without even considering, are people more willing to pay? Sometimes they're not, sometimes they are, but without even considering that. And then add to that retailer relationships and the benefits if you go through channels, where those are also worth tens of millions of dollars, that preferential shelf space. And loyalty, customer loyalty is a big factor in the profitability of the customer. One company discovered that their consumer packaged goods purchasing behavior wasn't really driven by their sustainability work, but the number one driver of loyalty was that sustainability, which means in total, you're looking at tens of millions of dollars or more in benefit from the value of values when it comes to customers once you quantify it. Now, this is true for where things are now, but what about that dynamic aspect? Well, when you have problems, consumers actually increase how much weight they put on these things once you have negative news about your company. We talked about this a little bit before, but it's not just being a laggard now, it's preventing yourself from having bad news in the future, because that makes the penalty even greater. Now we're going to take a quick minute to have a poll. This will pop up in your screen in a few seconds. Tell us how important you believe environmental and social issues will be to your customers in 3 to 5 years. Maybe a lot less important or a little, maybe the same, maybe a little or a lot more. Go ahead and use the polling feature to tell us what you think. Now, I've had this conversation with a lot of leaders, B2B and B2C, and for the most part, people see that there's an increase in their future. They believe that this is going to become more important. And to the extent that you believe that too, then we're looking at that case. And in this case, you can see how much this matters, right? A few people think it'll be less important, but look at the weighting towards greater importance, right? About 2/3 of people think it'll be more important, and about 1/3 of people think it'll be dramatically more important. And this is the case for the business to business and business to consumer leaders that I've typically talked to. Okay, let's close the poll and let's look at the next aspect here. The takeaway from this, right? We've already talked about submerged value being key, is that customers care about icing and about values. How do you take advantage of that? Well, the first thing is find the intersection of values and needs for you, for your customers, and for the world. And build that into your products and services. In the book, I talk about doing this with a health-related company. Let your customers know, because if they don't know that you share their values, then they can't prefer you for that reason. And monitor the evolution of expectations and actions, the kind we saw earlier, because as those things change, you need to stay abreast of them and ahead of them. That brings us to operations. This is the second aspect of core. And while customers, what we're talking about is how they feel differently based on values, in operations, we focus on how people see differently when values are involved. And for this, I'll use an example of an IBM semiconductor factory that brought in a lot of water, cold water, from the local water utility. Then what they did was they warmed that water up so it could be used in production. Meanwhile, elsewhere, there were cooling towers, cooling down water so it could be used to cool the important equipment that they used. At one point, they decided they wanted to save water. And they realized, hey, we can change the flow of the water. Take the cold water as it comes in and use it for cooling. Take the water that's already been warmed up by production, use it where we need warm water. This facility had been in place for decades, and yet they hadn't seen this before because they weren't looking in the same way. What was the result? Water savings of 29%. But not just water savings, but dollar savings of about $750,000 in water costs. And here is where submerged value comes back, because it wasn't just the water cost savings. Savings in things like energy and treatment costs were 4 times as much as the water cost savings. We talked about how submerged value is typically 4 to 10 times as much as visible value. That was the case here. And that's why Eric Berliner at IBM said, when you start to think this way, you don't see water in the pipes, you see dollars. And this is the case not just for efficiency, but also for innovation, because you have to think differently to innovate, and you have to think differently in order to create more values-driven performance. I was part of a team that actually quantified the relationship between sustainability leadership and innovation leadership. And what we found is that thinking differently mattered for both. In fact, sustainability leaders were 400% more likely to be innovation leaders. That brings us to our next takeaway. When you look closely and using values, you see new ideas, new opportunities, and new savings. How do you do that? Well, the first thing is take a new look at your operations through values lenses. And in the book, I talk about how to put on your values lenses. Work backward from ambitious targets, because ambitious targets also make you think differently and be more creative. Choose and embrace values-based constraints. Constraints actually generate innovation performance. If you've ever heard the saying, necessity is the mother of invention, then you're familiar with the way that this works. That brings us to our next piece, which is about risk. Now, customers was about feeling differently, and operations is about seeing differently. Risks is about looking differently. And we're going to start by asking you, how prepared was your company for COVID? Do you strongly disagree, strongly agree, or somewhere in the middle with the statement, my company was prepared for COVID? Now, we're going to go ahead and let you answer this question, but I'm going to tell you a story as we do that. It turns out that before COVID, but after SARS and MERS and swine flu and bird flu and other pandemics, one of the largest insurance companies in the world offered a pandemic insurance policy. In the entire world, they had one single customer. One customer. Which means if you're in the process of answering that your company was not that prepared, it wasn't just you. And in fact, over 50% of you disagree that your company was prepared for COVID, with over a third strongly disagreeing with that idea. When we go ahead and close the poll, we see how this connects to the need to think about seeing and looking differently. Because when you look through values lenses, you look at what the world needs and where it's going, and you see things that are different and that are potential risks. When Valuetist looked at the forces that are driving this decade the most, we looked at 30 different sources, 90% of which weren't focused on environmental or social attributes. And nonetheless, the number one force, even more than AI, that they said was driving the decade that we're in today, climate. And it's not just these organizations, but the hard dollars of investors. A study of 16,000 equities over a period of 4 years found that when investors see higher GHG emissions, there's a penalty in the stock price in the form of a lower PE ratio. Why? Because higher GHG emissions is a risk. and one that companies are going to have to deal with as things go forward. Now, this is true for things that are moving along and that we can already see, but what about events? And this is where we come back to the disruptions of things like COVID. Remember that insurance company had a single customer, and over half of you said your company wasn't prepared for COVID. Contrast that with the story of a battery startup that had sustainability pioneer Hunter Lovins on its board. And in 2019, she said, as part of their strategic planning exercise, what will you do if there's a pandemic? Now, the CEO said, you know what, that was kind of a weird question for me because I couldn't imagine, certainly not the US, being brought to its knees because of a pandemic. But as she later acknowledged, that one discussion may have saved the company. It not only survived COVID, it grew strongly through COVID. If you're not looking at the most vulnerable and the biggest risk to the world, then you miss these things. And that, in effect, means you're looking through rose-colored glasses. And as the saying goes, when you're wearing rose-colored glasses, red flags just look like flags. In order to help with this, in order to help visualize it, you can use tools. Here's an example of a tool that does just that. You enter your locations, and you can overlay heat risk onto that. And then you can add to heat risk things like hurricane and tropical storm risk. And then you can add yet another layer of wildfire risk all around the world. These are ways to visualize and to see and to look in different places for those risks. So let's go ahead and close the poll and go back to the risks section. Now here, what you'll see is that this takes us to something very important, which is that not only are sales influenced by values, but they become more sensitive to environmental and social ratings after disasters. And as disasters become more and more common, that means this is going to become an even bigger and bigger issue. And that brings us to our takeaways. Our new takeaway for risk is that values lenses help you see more risks and see them sooner. How do you do that? Well, think about what your business depends on. Think back to those resources, relationships, and routines that we talked about earlier. Which ones are already under pressure? And where would you look to see danger first? Not just in your own organization, but where in the world would you look to see these kinds of challenges? That brings us to the E in core, employees. Now, employees in some ways is really intuitive benefit because, as John Wooden said decades ago, good values are like a magnet for attracting good people. And that, of course, helps with recruiting. Now, by definition, if you're hiring for a position, then that person will create more value for you than the cost of employing them. If that weren't the case, you would simply stop recruiting for that position, which means that every month that goes by with that position unfilled, you're losing value. And recruiting faster and more successfully is one way that values create value. This is especially true when it comes to the very best people. As the former CEO of the world's largest ready-mix concrete company said, even where there's high unemployment generally, the very talented individuals always have options. If you want the best people, then you want to have values that align with them. And it turns out this is also true in reverse. Values can repel as well as attract. If people believe that you have a company and a product that are making people less happy, it's supporting attacks on democracy, then people are less likely to want to work for you, even if it's a company that pays well, is famous, high technology. As Jonathan Vanian says, Facebook and Meta are experiencing this right now. When we switch from getting people in recruiting to making them productive when they're there, we see yet another benefit of values. A study published by the US Department of Defense found a 10% improvement in employee commitment leads to a 2% improvement in their performance on the job. That brings us to a poll. And please take a second to think about this. If you have a company that's 50,000 people, and average salary is a little under 40,000, what's a conservative estimate of the benefit if employees know that the company shares their values? Go ahead and take a second to think about this and let us know what you think. Now, the reason that we're doing this is because although the idea that employees want to work for a company that shares their values is intuitive, what often happens is that that value is not quantified. And when you don't quantify it, then you can't put it in the spreadsheet. If you put, I'm not really sure into a spreadsheet, you get 0. And that's not the right answer. What you need to do is think about, how do you quantify that? And how much is it worth? Even if it's a very conservative number. The things that people are entering here, let's take a look at the results and see, what do you think? Okay, now, if you look at this, you see that over half believe that it's, say, under $10 million. And 3/4 believe it's under 20. But what happens when we actually run the calculation? Well, we have a tool that does that. If we go ahead and close the poll, we'll show you what it looks like when we actually do that calculation. This tool starts, as with the previous ones, with the basics of the company. For example, how big is it, revenue, employees, and so on. And then looks at things like growth rate, attrition rate, developed versus developing economies, and so forth. What are hiring and non-salary costs? How long does it take to attract someone? About 24 different factors, including benefits and taxes and loaded costs, the total number of employees that have to be hired in order to keep up the growth rate and to replace the people who are leaving, and the amount of engagement that the company has. Now, Gallup says that typically around the world, this is about 33%, but to be conservative, we'll say it's much higher than that. People are much more engaged already. We'll say 50%. When you look at all of that and look at the gain from employees seeing that the company connects with their values more than they thought, even when you add in the costs of doing the programs, the value is about $25 million. Now, you'll notice this is much more than most people think. And it's not just you. I was once talking to somebody who ran what they called corporate social responsibility, a 60,000 person company. And she said, I think it's worth $3 million a year. But if you ask my executives, they would say 300,000. The first problem is that 10x difference is a big problem. The second problem is when we actually ran the calculations, we ended up with about $30 million. That's about 10 times what she thought and about 100 times what her executives thought. Okay, going back to the slides, you see that what we've done is we've moved from looking at employees to quantifying the value that they create. And quantifying in particular this takeaway, which is that values mean more, better, productive employees. Now that leads us to what do we do to capture that value? Well, the first thing is to think about and find out, what do current and prospective employees think of the company's values? Do they know what they are? Do they believe that you believe in them? The second is to determine how to demonstrate those values to employees and prospects. It's not enough to say these are our values, obviously. How do you demonstrate them? And then the third thing is to design experiments that track the effect of your efforts. How much is this working? How much is it connecting with people? And what can you do better to really connect with people on a values level and generate all those benefits that we've been talking about? That leads us to our next section, personal leadership. The truth is that values change us when we put them front and center in our minds. When you think about what you want people to say at your funeral, it changes how you act. toward doing good. And when people see that, they're more likely to want to follow you. As they see you live your values, they become more willing to follow you where you're going. LeVar Burton, actor, director, and host, puts it this way. He says that he couldn't follow a leader without shared values and without authenticity to those values. And he's not alone. In fact, this insight is 2,000 years old. When Aristotle was writing about the key aspects of persuasion, ethos, pathos, and logos, ethos, who the speaker is, was one of the three pillars, and it has the same root as the word ethics. And that leads to our final takeaway, which is people are more willing to follow leaders with values. How do you capture that? Well, first, write your eulogy. Who were you? Look backward from 5 and 10 years in the future in your career. And then make crystal clear to yourself what you won't accept. Not only what you did, not only what you're proud of, but the lines you are not willing to cross. Design and use ways of taking those things and putting them into your decision making. And guard your integrity. It's all too easy to do something that's against your values just this once. But when you guard your integrity and people see it, they're more likely to follow you. That brings us to the two big challenges that happen when we want to act on values. The first is the challenge of ROI. IBM's survey of 3,000 CEOs found that sustainability was their number one challenge, and ROI was the number one barrier to action. How do you address that? You quantify the value of values, as we've been doing today. The second is that KPMG found two interrelated barriers. One, capacity constraints, and two, ROI again. And of course, these are related because it's easier to get investment if you have a strong ROI case. But how do you deal with it if you don't have additional investment yet? You use tools that unlock value. Tools like the ones that we've been showing today. Fundamentally, the key thing is that people right now are not seeing and quantifying the value of values. And when they do that, they run smack into the observation of Professor John Sterman. If you don't measure something that matters, you're giving it the only value it can't possibly have, which is zero. And that is not the correct value of values.
Wow, that was a lot to absorb there, Daniel. And so we're going to dig into some of that in the Q&A section. One of the things I wanted to start with was when you think about, there are a lot of different components to getting to a place where you not only are driving your business based on values, but quantifying it. And so in your experience, how does a business values-based approach actually get started? Given the different dimensions that you have of customers, operations, risk, are there different entry points into that? And what are you seeing among the companies that are actually doing this?
Typically, the entry point is around customers, because typically, if you think about the audiences inside your company, typically what customers want and customer behavior resonates with a lot of them, with marketing, with sales, with finance, and so forth. We always recommend that you start with what we call AIM, which is who are the audiences that you need to persuade? What are the information and metrics that matter to them and that they'll believe? And what's the right messaging? And that means, for example, looking at customer behavior. For one company, we looked at 30,000 B2B customers and divided them into an experimental and a control group, and discovered that the ones that connected with the company on values bought more, stayed longer, and bought higher margin products. And that created more resonance and more support inside the organization.
And then does that entry point coming from the customer perspective encourage sort of the bleed into those other areas, or How do we get into the operations and the risk and the employee parts of it?
Yeah, it does. In fact, it flows nicely. Now, that doesn't mean you can't come in these other ways, right? If you need to improve innovation performance, you can certainly start there. But starting with customers creates a nice downhill effect, because if customers care, then how do you create more values-based products? How do you operate in a more value-based way? That's where operations comes in. And as you do that, you see risks to that. You see things that the world is moving toward, and that's where risks come in. And as you do that, and as employees see you actually taking action in those directions, then they see the connection between your values and theirs.
So Howard has a question. What is a true litmus test for values that are really working for you, rather than just the list of great but unbelievable words on the wall? And I think, one of your points was you really have to demonstrate the value. Can you talk a little bit more about how that demonstration works?
Yeah, absolutely. The short version is that you need to put it into action, and you need to create experiments that demonstrate that people are seeing it. Values on the wall, discussed values, they don't matter. When people see that you're putting money, time, effort, thought into, for example, making your products more sustainable, or helping society, or helping people who need a leg up. Like one company I worked with helped people to get back into the workforce when they'd been out for various reasons. When people see you doing that, that's not about what you say, that's about what you do. And then what you want to do is create experiments. For one company, we created an experiment where they looked at the baseline of the connection between the employees and the company. People usually have employee surveys every year and so forth, but they're not usually designed experimentally. And then we did experiments to see if, in fact, doing more changed that relationship and changed the behavior of those employees. That's how you really demonstrate, both to employees and to skeptics, finance, and quantitatively implying personnel, what you're doing.
So it occurred to me, as you were talking about the employee piece of it, that that seemed like a little bit of the trickier piece, because with customers, as a company, you can say, okay, we want to align with customers who have these certain values, but employees come with lots of different values, and politically especially, and ideas about approaches to the environment, whatever. So how do you think about that? When you're going for high performing employees, because those are the ones that are most in demand, but then you're aligning with the values of the company. Can you talk about how that intersection works?
Yeah, and this is a very good point. And in fact, Cook Political Report had a piece about this. Amy Walter wrote it about the connection between employees and where companies need to recruit, and the values and the politics and so forth. In the book, I define values as the outward facing ones, to get away from things like religion and other personal values. Those are important, but those in the book. What I focus on in the book is values that are related to doing good for the world and those in it. And this is things like improving environmental performance, improving society, and improving the lot of those people that your employees care about, their community, for example. There's usually a lot of common ground if you find it. And sometimes there's a need for that willingness to be courageous. For example, in the 1950s, and I tell this story in the book also, IBM wanted to put factories in North Carolina and in Kentucky. And at that time, segregation was legal in those states. And IBM said, you know what? We're not going to put the factories there if they have to be segregated. And as you know, if you've been to North Carolina and to the Research Triangle area, IBM succeeded in getting those factories, those facilities integrated by standing up for their values. When they had their 100-year recap of the history of IBM, this is one area that they talked about and were proud of. You want to see the core values that you and your customers share, and your employees and your stakeholders, and you want to think, what can I do that I'll be proud of in the future, just like IBM did?
Yeah, and I think that's that whole stakeholder space where you're trying to align all of those different, employees, customers, your own thoughts about the impact of the company on the world. That fantastic goal, but certainly tricky to actually pull that all together. So Magdalena has a great question, which is, should employees be broadly engaged in forming the company's values, or should they rely on management? In other words, is forming the values solely the duty of management, or how's that sort of top down, bottom up approach to values happening?
It shouldn't be just top down. And in fact, it can't be just top down, but it has to be lived by top executives. That's the short answer. Everyone can be involved. And in fact, in a case of a business that my company worked with, lots and lots of people were involved, but it has to be lived and operated, and the top management have to show that they not only talk about it, but they actually act on it. Now, this kind of relates to something that we were just talking about around politics, but I think it's an important addition, which is that you will find that people have different values, but the values that I talk about in the book, the ones that are oriented toward doing good for the world and those who live in it, are more popular on net. I believe we were actually one of the first to publish data showing that if you are a sustainability leader in, for example, climate, that some customers, even if, say, performance, price, everything else are equal, some customers will actually punish you for that. But on net, you benefit. And you especially benefit if you can tailor your message so that the customers who react negatively to climate leadership, you talk about the things that they care about. And the customers who react positively, you talk to them about the climate leadership that you have. However, the important thing is, although this is true, on net, it's still better to be demonstrating values that help the world and those in it, even though some people may disagree with some things.
So for those companies that aren't great at actually demonstrating it and are more still relying on, sort of talking about the values without actually demonstrating it, this is a question from Viksha Rao. How significantly does greenwashing impede effective communication of genuine sustainability values in your view?
It's interesting because that's another question where we brought actual data that I hadn't seen before. The short answer is, of course it matters. In fact, when we looked at whether people believed sustainability, responsibility, and social claims, a lot of people were skeptical that they were true. But here's the thing. Even though that's the case, companies that talk about their values benefit from more trust, even when some people are skeptical. And that's because although it's not 100% the case that people won't greenwash, on average, people know that the old truism is correct, which is that if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. If they see that you don't stand for anything, they don't know what you're willing to do, what lines you're willing to cross. And so greenwashing is an issue, and you should absolutely make it clear what you're doing, not what you're saying. And of course, what you're doing matters a lot. But even getting started helps, because people know that standing for something is better than not standing for anything.
Yeah, and that's something that organizations all over the place struggle with. I just saw a piece this morning about in the education space, should universities speak up around what's happening in Gaza, or should they not? And that's a really tricky thing for a lot of organizations. So Judy Nichols said she just read an article. She thought it was in MIT Tech Review that spoke about sustainability, and it indicated that as much as CEOs and companies are talking about sustainability, the reality is that budgets are being cut back on what they're spending on sustainability as they're focusing on the bottom line and profits, and therefore this is an area that is being cut. Are you seeing that, and what are your thoughts on that as it seems to go against this, the evidence-based approach that you're talking about?
Well, there are two things. One is there are clearly cases where that's true, although I would say in general it's not. KPMG just did a study where they looked at thousands of different companies. And on average, those companies were planning to increase spending on those kinds of issues. But it's certainly true that there are some reductions in spending. And that comes back to the challenge of ROI and value. And that's why we're having this discussion. That's why I wrote the book. Because there's a famous saying, and I put this in the book as well, where one person said, if we have to spend even one more penny to buy the sustainable product, even though we're as sustainable a company as there is out there, we won't do it. And the thing that is so important about that statement is that if you think about it in terms of connection to the business, it doesn't make any sense. Would somebody say, we're as customer-focused a company as there is, but if we have to spend one more penny on customers, we're not going to do it? No, they would never say that. And you can see this when it comes to the difference between sustainability and IT. Sure, there's a lot more sustainability regulation. Some people are shifting their money toward regulatory compliance. But the same thing is true of IT. Right? GDPR came out, and people spent more on compliance, but they didn't stop spending money on IT. Why? Because they could see that that's part of the business. And what people who want to see businesses do more with values have to do is demonstrate that this is part of the business, that it creates business value. That's what the book is about. And that's the secret of submerged value, is showing that people are missing that connection.
Right. Anjum has been working in this space for a long time and working with organizations for a long time, and says, out of my experience of working with companies in the past 30 years is that CEOs value the value only when they get into crisis. Otherwise, they're generally stuck with cognitive and motivational hurdles. What do you think about that? And how do you overcome sort of the skeptics around this topic?
There are two ways to overcome this. And I think it's true for some, but not all. But even when it is true, there are two ways to overcome it. One is to demonstrate that this isn't about events and crises. This is about the facts of business today and tomorrow. Today, 500,000 data points on 4 continents show that when you experimentally change the social and environmental attributes of a product, it changes preference today. And as we saw earlier, that is increasing. The second thing is that you address this by correcting the impression that crises are kind of outside the realm of planning. There's a great article in an Australian publication that says, what are 100-year events and why do they keep happening so often? And that's true, right? We keep having, quote, once in 100-year floods and once in 100-year droughts. And it's affecting things today. The Port of Vancouver was backed up for months because of drought, rains, mudslides that closed almost all the highways and all the rail links into the 3rd busiest port in North America. So it doesn't have to be your crisis. It doesn't have to be your disruption. Even if you're nowhere near Vancouver, if you use that port to get things in or out, that disruption affects you. And that's why there's a large repeating section of the book called Now More Than Ever. These things do matter, and they're mattering now more than ever.
Yeah, and I think your poll showed that really clearly with this audience, that there's an awareness, and there's, these issues have become so big and affecting so many people and organizations and countries all over the world that it's not something that can be ignored. Quick question from Brenda Stone about how this applies to different kinds of products. That she says, I wonder how true this return on values is for products that are highly price sensitive, and how does that factor in?
It turns out that as far as we can tell, and again, 500,000 data points on 4 continents, business to business, business to consumer, that this matters for all kinds of products. Now, it matters somewhat differently, but when products are highly price sensitive, typically that's because they're highly commoditized. And in that case, values actually present the opportunity for tremendous value. Because in a commoditized market, where price and availability and quality and so forth are very similar, standing out is that much more difficult. And in fact, we worked with some agricultural commodity producers. And in that market, there's a tremendous amount of commodity that is pretty much equal between different producers. But in their case, sustainability actually helped them stand out. Even if you can't charge any more for it, what happens if your market share goes up? That's worth something, right? It helps you to spread your fixed costs over a bigger base. That's why this relates to a question that people often ask, which is a little bit different, which is who pays for more values-based action? Is it you by cutting your margins? Is it the customer by paying more? The answer is neither. Your competitors pay by losing share to you, just as they would if they had lower quality products, if they have lower values products, they pay by losing share to you.
Speaking of competitors, Gary Bernard wants to know, do you have experience of companies working together for sustainability improvement rather than competing, given that this is such a big global issue?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of pre-competitive initiatives, and that's one way that companies can become what I call catalysts. For example, Nike and others were early into the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to do pre-competitive improvements in apparel sustainability. Now, obviously, there are legal issues about when and how much and on what topics you can coordinate. But industries can and do engage in pre-competitive in order to improve the performance of the overall industry and its sustainability.
There are a couple of questions, so we have time for one or two more questions, and we've got a couple that have come in around the topic of change. So Kayla was asking, what are some change management strategies when new leadership enters and wants to start a more values-based organization?
Yeah, when new leadership wants to start, that's a really good time, obviously, to start. But it's key to connect it to their initiatives. Often new leadership wants to grow. And that's a pretty broad-based ambition for the company. A lot of people want the company to grow and succeed more in the marketplace. Connecting values to that helps. Also, getting that initial bump of investment, of time, it doesn't even have to be money necessarily, although that certainly helps, but even time and attention, that initial investment in a pilot with a design to take that pilot and scale it and to use it to prove to the important audiences what this is worth. Because it comes back to aim. Sure, new executives and new leadership might want to do this, but the question is, what are the audiences that they're going to have to persuade? That could include, say, the board, investors, customers, and so on, in addition to internal audiences. What information and metrics do those audiences find credible? And what kind of messengers and what kind of messaging can they use? If you can help new leadership do that, you can help speed up that desired ambition.
Great. This other question around change is a little bit different. Values change over time. What a set of values is 5 years ago maybe has changed today. And so the question from Rahul is, can values keep changing for an organization as time changes, and how does one manage that?
Yes, values can change, but the kinds of values that I talk about in the book and the kinds that I want to focus on here typically don't. Okay. The idea of benefiting the world and those who live in it, about 2,000 years ago, Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius said, "Have I done something good for the world? Then I share in the benefits." And the Buddha said something very similar about lighting a path for others, creating light for you. And of course, there are plenty of religious and philosophical traditions that say this as well. It's true that some values change, and more importantly, some instantiations of value change, right? What kinds of equality we care about may change. But equality and doing good for the world and those who are in it, those values tend to be very, very consistent, even over time.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question. This is kind of an interesting one. So Nuke asks, how would you advise an organization in the financial services industry to sell its values to customers who are asking for competitive returns and at the same time asking for investments in ethical funds?
Right, and this is a good question, and in fact, it's one that I've had experience with financial service companies specifically. And the short answer is that just like with any customer, you want to look at that scorecard for how they choose. They're going to select usually primarily on competitive returns. But there are two things you can do. One is you can say, we give you competitive returns and we help you put your values into practice. And in fact, there are thousands of studies of the return on ESG, sustainability, social, employee, whatever you want to call all these different factors. For the most part, they show improved returns. But even when they don't show improved returns, they very rarely show any penalty. So the first answer is, we can give you what everybody else is giving you and something else, right? The icing on the investment cake. The second thing is, there are these penalties now, and especially more so in the future, around company stock performance. We talked about the research into the 16,000 equities. We looked at the things coming down the pike in terms of the big trends for this decade, responding to problems, disruptions, and so forth. And so if you focus on those things that matter for the world and being a contributor to those and seeing those in advance, you can get better returns and you can do something for values. But at the very least, you're giving them something in addition to competitive returns.
Fantastic. So Daniel, we are out of time for more questions. We've got lots more great questions that came in. We'll share those with you later. But just to wrap up, tell us a little bit about the book and what people can do to take that next step.
Sure, absolutely. The first thing is that when we go back to the slides, you can get the book here. If you want to hear more about some of these case studies, if you want to see detailed financial examples, if you want to hear more stories about change, you can use the QR code here. And the second thing is, if you have more questions, if you want to talk about something that might help you, connect with me on LinkedIn. I keep publishing articles about this to try to get the word out, to try to help people who want to make a difference and people who want higher returns, more ROI, and don't realize that this is a way to do it. And you can use this QR code to connect with me on LinkedIn, ask questions, and see some of those pieces of content.
Daniel, thank you so much. Thank you for providing us with such great ammunition to advance values within the context of corporations who are profit-driven, and we really appreciate your being with us today. Thank you to all of you in the audience, and have a great rest of your day.